Sit in your Bible study tables. Some of you may still wish to do that. You may sit where you want this evening. Tomorrow morning, when we convene at 8:30, you are invited to sit in your Bible study tables again. You may sit where you want this evening.
Grabbed coffee instead, and the coffee was cold, so I didn't even drink that.
I just poured water all over myself. That's very nice.
It was pretty much a wash.
Your mic is on.
Okay.
It's pretty awful.
Please stand. We begin our evening session with what's called the Remembering the Children prayer. This prayer was written on the occasion of the church leaders' tour across the country in 2009, supporting the call for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada. It was one of the most extraordinary privileges I had as a primate in my early days in this office. And this was the prayer we used across the country. God of our ancestors, who holds the spirits of our grandmothers and grandfathers and the spirits of our grandchildren, remembering the children, we now pledge ourselves to speak the truth, and with our hearts and our souls to act upon the truth we have heard, of the injustices lived, of the sufferings inflicted, of the tears cried, of the misguided intentions imposed, and of the power of prejudice and racism, which were allowed to smother the sounds and laughter of the forgotten children. Hear our cries of lament for what was allowed to happen and for what will never be. In speaking and hearing and acting upon the truth, may we as individuals and as a nation meet the hope of a new beginning. Great Creator God, who desires that all creation live in harmony and peace, remembering the children, we dare to dream of a path of reconciliation where apology from the heart leads to healing of the heart, and the chance of restoring the circle where justice walks with all, where respect leads to true partnership, where the power to change comes from each heart. Hear this our prayer of hope, and guide this country of Canada on a new and different path. Amen.
It is my great privilege and pleasure to welcome Kayla Johnston. Kayla is the Acting Manager of Education, Outreach, and Public Programming for the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation, which is essentially the organization that carries on the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission so that Canadians may continue to learn and understand what has happened in the residential schools, may continue to learn and understand what is asked of us as we rebuild a relationship that has been so deeply compromised and wounded. Kayla, thank you for being with us. Please show Kayla the welcome and respect and love that we have for this work. Kayla.
Usually my height affects how well people can hear me because of the height of the microphone. But hello and good evening. My name is Kayla Johnston, and I'm the Active Manager for Education, Outreach, and Public Programming at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. Since 2010, I have worked in the field of reconciliation in various capacities, from a statement gatherer with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to coordination efforts for the National Center. Working with both organizations has allowed me the opportunity to travel across Canada, speaking and engaging with survivors, intergenerational survivors, as well as former staff members and other individuals whose lives were affected by the residential school system. I have seen firsthand the effects of the colonial systems of oppression and have felt them as well, being an intergenerational survivor whose relatives attended schools in both Saskatchewan and Alberta. This evening, I'm going to speak on the work of the National Center, reconciliation, and engagement. Now, I often like to talk quite a bit, but I would also like to keep things going as they should, so hopefully I will finish within 10 and 15 minutes. There are 141 institutions recognized under the settlement agreement and 5 under a separate agreement for Newfoundland and Labrador. Out of the current number of recognized schools, 29 were administered by the Anglican Church, from St. George in the west to La Tuque in the east and as far north as Shingle Point. The first 3 federally funded schools are highlighted in purple: St. Mary's Mission, Spanish, and Mount Elgin. Highlighted in green is the last school opened, Kivalukuk Hall, which operated from 1985 to 1997 and was recently added to the settlement agreement last month. Highlighted in blue is the last school that was closed, Le Bret, which was opened from 1884 to 1998, which is 114 years. There are approximately 16 schools still standing today in various states of use and decay. Some schools, such as Elkhorn, pictured there, are hollowed out shells and are on privately owned land, while others, like Shingwak, have been repurposed as centers of learning. A question I have for you today is, how many of you know the closest residential school to you? Was it an Anglican school or another denomination? What were the years of its operation, and what communities had children in attendance? This is one of the first steps you can take on your journey of reconciliation, getting to know the school that once stood nearest to you, as well as the communities affected by it. You may be asking yourself, well, how might I do that? Well, a visit to our database is a good place to start. Now, the TRC has closed its doors after the release of the final report in December of 2015. This does not mean it is the end of the Commission's work. On the contrary, we are now able to see the long road ahead of us. At the National Center, we were born out of the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement, though we officially opened our doors in November of 2015 with the launch of our online database. Our center is the permanent home for all documents, materials, and statements gathered by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Our mandate is to ensure that survivors, their families, and Canadians will have access to the shared history of residential schools, that educators can share this history with new generations of students, and that researchers can delve deeper into the residential school experience, as well as that the history and legacy are never forgotten. In our collection, we have over 5 million records and growing, as we receive more documents from institutions like Library and Archives Canada. Additionally, our center holds more than 7,000 hours of audio-video footage recorded from survivors, their families, and anyone else who wished to share something about the residential school experience. On our database, you can currently access 54,000 items, including text documents, photographs, and videos. This includes information on the 29 Anglican residential schools across Canada. Now, one of the schools I'm going to highlight or talk about and pull documents from is from All Saints Anglican School, located in Aklavik, Northwest Territories. Now, the story that I want to briefly touch on comes from a letter sent by a teacher named Eden Corlett, who taught at All Saints in the early 1940s. The reason why I want to share this story is because I believe it's a good example of what can be learned from materials in our archive. On March 13, 1944, Miss Eden sent a 5-page letter to the Department of Pension and National Health, which was then forwarded to the Department of Indian Affairs. In this letter, Miss Eden outlines several areas of concern surrounding the administration of the school and the treatment of the children. Most concerning to her were hygienic conditions, fire safety, quality of education, and quality of food. Enclosed in this letter was a menu which Miss Eden states, "I'm enclosing a menu, the exact contents of which I ate myself for 1 whole week last August to ascertain whether or not it was sufficient, and I can truthfully say I was hungry." Furthermore, she states, of the $100 allotted by the government for each child in the school, only $20.52 is spent on food per year, as compared to $162.19 for each staff member. That's a fact that can be proved. I studied all the invoices, checked off the food allotted to the children. When I present on this topic to schools and groups, I do a calorie count of this menu. Up on the screen, you will see a calorie count for Monday, which totals 1,183 calories. A 6-year-old child needs between 1,200 to 14 calories per day, while a child between 9 and 13 needs 1,600 to 2,600 calories per day. As you can see on this menu, a 6-year-old child was not getting fed, let alone children who were 5 to 15 in attendance at this school. Now, one of the frequent questions we get asked at the center is whether or not there was any good staff or teachers at residential schools. While Miss Eden's letter is proof there were people who cared very greatly for their students, however, what I'll note about her letter, it is the only one I have found thus far in our public archive from a staff member advocating on behalf of the students' welfare. This is not to say she was the only one, simply that is the only letter that has survived and is available for the public to see. Now, on the second last page of her letter, Miss Eden writes, "I have taught a number of races, both European and white, and I know that these children are brilliant as any I've ever encountered. Given a chance, they could be doctors, nurses, engineers, teachers, ministers, artists, or enter any trade or profession they choose and show remarkable aptitude, returning to their own field to replace the white man." She further states, "We have 2 great native races in this country, but so much of their art and potentialities are being lost because of men who take only a cursory glance and administer from far-off fields." Now, after Miss Eden's letter was received, there was an investigation into the conditions at the Aklavik school, which found the quality and quantity of food was lacking. Now, up on screen, I have a letter from Dr. L.D. Livingston, the medical examiner in Aklavik. In his letter, he states, "I personally in my own house have at least as much fresh fruit shipped in as they use in a school for 90 children and a staff of 10. Additionally, he states, "The milk is not sufficient and apparently has not been mixed to the proper strength. Very little cheese, butter are supplied, and the 4 essentials of fruit, milk, cheese, and butter I think are very important and should be increased." Now, unfortunately, Dr. Livingston ended his letter with the following statement. "I might state, however, that in my medical care of the Anglican school, much of my work is in the care of the female staff. A great deal of the trouble is due to neuroses, caused no doubt due to environment and diet. I suggest that the period of 4 years be cut down. I think 2 years here is long enough for any girl. Now, as much as Ms. Eden's letter demonstrates there were, in some cases, caring individuals working at residential schools, unfortunately, they were up against such a massive colonial institution that was resistant to change that there was very little that could be done. Now, the reason why I've dedicated so much of my time to this case tonight is because it's necessary to know where you've been, to know where you're going. For reconciliation to occur, the truth of the past needs to become known, and with that, let's switch gears to the present. Now, the TRC defined reconciliation as an ongoing process of establishing and maintaining respectful relationships. However, depending on who you ask, you may get a variety of definitions. The TRC further stated that critical to reconciliation is repairing damaged trust by making apologies, providing individual and collective reparations, and following through with actions for real societal change. Now, this is where the calls to action come in. In June 2015, the TRC released the 94 calls to action, which outline areas in need of work to redress the legacy of residential schools and advance the progress of reconciliation in Canada. There are 22 thematic areas that cover everything from child welfare to new Canadians. You can find paper copies as well as digital, such as on the CBC website Beyond 94, which I just showed. Now, often we're asked at the center, what can we do? We've read the calls to action, but what is the next step? Now, one of the best pieces of advice I've been given is you don't have to do all 94, just pick one. So I encourage you to look through the calls to action and find that call that speaks to you and make a commitment to it. Now, to make this process a little bit easier, as it can be daunting, I'm going to put up on screen 6 actions of reconciliation you can apply to any one of the calls to action. They are: learn the history between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, understand the history and legacy of residential schools, explore the unique intersections we have between treaty, constitutional, Indigenous, and human rights, recognize the rich contributions that Indigenous peoples have made to Canada, take action to address historical injustices and present-day wrongs, and finally, and really most importantly, teach others. Now, I'm now going to offer you an example of what this process can look like, and some of you may actually be engaging in activities around learning and understanding, which is fantastic. Now, firstly, when it comes to learning and understanding history, I encourage you to bring in and engage traditional knowledge keepers, elders, survivors, and local community members to speak on topics such as treaties, language, culture, traditions, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and other related topics. You can also pick up a copy of the TRC's final report, which can be found for free on our database, or a copy of A Knock on the Door, an abridged version of the summary report, and read about the history of residential schools and their effect on Indigenous peoples in Canada. When it comes to exploring rights, the first TRC principle of reconciliation states, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is the framework for reconciliation. A reconciliation framework is one in which Canada's political and legal systems, educational and religious institutions, the corporate sector, and the civil society function in ways that are consistent with the rights of Indigenous peoples. These articles address the most significant issues affecting Indigenous peoples today, their civil, political, social, economic, and cultural rights, and also bears on the right to self-determination, spirituality, language, lands, territories, resources, and really free, prior, and informed consent. Now, these first 3 steps offer a very good basis for you to delve deeper on your journey of reconciliation. In the last few minutes I have, I'm going to get a little more specific and talk about the Regina Indian Industrial School Cemetery site and what a group has done to begin rectifying a historical injustice. Now, although the school was open for less than 25 years, there are 35 unidentified graves in the cemetery, with only 2 marked with stones. Like many former schools on private lands, the area was at risk for redevelopment, and in 2016, a group of concerned citizens, including city councilors, elders, survivors, banded together and were able to get the city and province to recognize and give the cemetery heritage status. Last month, a ceremony was held, and the land was transferred to the Regina Indian Industrial School Commemorative Association, who will take care of the property from here on out. The association has plans to apply for federal heritage status, erecting a memorial and a tribute to descendants from the school. Janine Wildorf, the chair of the Reconciliation Regina, states, "We can be proud of what we've accomplished, but we still have a lot of work to do. It's going to take at least a couple generations until we see the impact of our work, and so we know that we can't put everything on this current council." Reconciliation Regina is a steering committee initiated by the Mayor of Regina and closely related to the association. They've engaged in activities like holding blanket exercises, hosting free public screenings of films like Indian Horse, hosting youth symposiums, participating in Orange Shirt Day activities, participating in National Indigenous Peoples Day activities, and attending both provincial and national reconciliation meetings. These are some of the activities you can engage in too and bring about and spread awareness to the calls to action in general or on your call to action specifically. Other activities that can be engaged in are letter writing campaigns and reaching out to your MPs to show your support for bills like Bill S-206, or volunteering or donating to organizations like First Nations Child and Family Caring Society. Now, remember when I asked whether you knew about the closest residential school to you? Do you know about its cemetery or cemeteries? It's estimated there could be upwards of 400 unidentified burial sites across Canada, which amounts to 2 to 3 unidentified sites per school. Some former schools, such as Shingwak, have very active communities which take care of their cemetery, while others are a little more difficult to manage because they are on private property, are often isolated, and often forgotten over time. Now, the photo you see up there is actually of the Shingwak Cemetery. I was able to visit it last August when they operated and opened up the Reclaiming Shingwak gallery space. So they do have a fairly active survivor society, and as you can see, it is a very well-maintained cemetery site with a memorial cairn as well as a bench there. The most recent grave from that cemetery is from 2015, where a staff member of Algoma University was buried there. He was an individual who worked very closely to ensure that the Shingwak survivors were going to be part of that university proper. So there's still so much work to be done locating cemeteries and burial sites, which is done with the assistance of records collected by the TRC, but also working directly with communities, community members, survivors, elders, as outlined in the calls to action 71 to 76. So I encourage you to visit our database and find the closest residential school to you. Do a bit of research and find out whether there has been any activity done to take care of or protect the cemetery or cemeteries. Offer your support to organizations like Reconciliation Regina, whose mission is to encourage, advocate, support, promote, take action, and facilitate truth and reconciliation initiatives, both at the local level, collaborating with community stakeholders. For survivors, intergenerational survivors, and everyone affected by the legacy of residential schools, a commitment to a call to action helps reestablish a respectful relationship. Reconciliation should not be seen as a finite goal to be achieved and promptly forgotten, but should be recognized as an ongoing process to be acknowledged and renewed year after year. We need to acknowledge the difficulties Indigenous peoples have had due to the harmful policies implemented by the federal government and the churches, but also acknowledge the resilience of Indigenous peoples to overcome this painful legacy and reclaim their cultural identities. It's through partnerships with communities, educational institutions, and organizations that we are able to spread awareness and pass down valuable knowledge to our younger generation so that Canada can continue on its healing journey of reconciliation. Thank you very much.
What a privilege and an honor it has been to hear your voice, to share your witness, to have your commitment bring energy to our gathering. Please accept this gift as a token of our respect for your work and our love for the new relationship that we're forging with Indigenous peoples.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We now welcome to the podium Melanie Delva, who is our animator for reconciliation. I referenced her ministry in my address this morning, and she's going to speak to us regarding the initiative All Parties Lessons Learned. Welcome, Melanie.
Good evening. Kwekwe, Sego, Bojo, Tanze, Anin, Wachea, Unukut, Oki, Gilikazla, Bonjour. Hello. Oh, great, you're real. That's amazing. My name is Melanie Delva, and I have the privilege of serving as the reconciliation animator for the Anglican Church. It's my honor to speak with you today about the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement. What we as a church have learned from our experience of being signatories to this agreement, and what we still need to learn in order to live better into right relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. I'd like to begin by reading to you from the book of Ezra, chapter 3. Ezra, I'm sure you all have memorized because it's a real party favorite. The context of this passage is that Israel has been loosed from captivity in Babylon and has returned to Jerusalem under the leadership of Zerubbabel and Jeshua the high priest. The people begin to rebuild the temple. I hope you'll keep it in mind as I talk to you about the Lessons Learned report. So, from the book of Ezra. When the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, the priests in their vestments and with trumpets, and the Levites, sons of Asaph, with cymbals, took their places to praise the Lord as prescribed by David, king of Israel. With praise and thanksgiving, they sang to the Lord, "He is good. His love endures forever." All the people gave a great shout of praise to the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord had been laid. But many of the older priests and Levites and family heads who had seen the former temple wept aloud when they saw the foundation of this temple being laid, while others shouted for joy. No one could distinguish the sound of the shouts of joy from the sound of the weeping, because the noise was so great. For those who may not be aware, in 2005, the Anglican Church of Canada signed the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement. This was a legally binding agreement that addressed the largest class action lawsuit in Canadian history, filed by survivors and former students of the residential schools. In 2018, the parties who were signatories to this agreement, which included the Government of Canada, other churches who ran residential schools, as well as the national Indigenous organizations, together agreed to collaborate on formal lessons learned exercises with the objective of reflecting on the agreement to inform ongoing reconciliation and resolution activities. This included not just the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is the part of the agreement that most of us have probably heard about. It also includes healing activities, commemoration, the common experience payment, the independent assessment process, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In the Anglican Church of Canada, this exercise was undertaken by the Reconciliation Animator and included 32 online survey respondents, 11 participants in a survivor circle, and 10 one-on-one interviews, resulting in over 120 pages of notes and responses. These responses were compiled into a 21-page report entitled One Step on a Journey, which was submitted to the parties in January of 2019. At the end of February, a delegation from the Anglican Church joined with the rest of the parties in Ottawa to bring together the reports and consider common themes. In order to make the detailed report more accessible, a double-sided, one-page, easy-to-read summary was also prepared, and both are in your convening circular. These were both shared with the Anglican Council of Indigenous Peoples, the Vision Keepers Council, the Primates Commission on Discovery, Reconciliation, and Justice, the Anglican Church of Canada Leadership Team, the House of Bishops, and the Council of General Synod. I want to note that throughout the process, I was and am aware that this exercise and the reports that were created, conducted, and compiled were written by a non-Indigenous settler person, me. I have, to the best of my ability, approached the work very aware of my place of privilege, both in Canadian society and in the church. To try to balance this out, I consulted with Indigenous leadership along the way. I sought for the report to favor the responses of Indigenous participants. And as often as possible, I used direct quotes in the report so that I would not be interpreting what was said. I believe that this needs to be named. Full disclosure, this was hard. I learned a lot, and some of the things that I learned were hard to hear, and incredibly important for us to hear, I believe. Particularly difficult was to hear of the pain surrounding the fact that we as an Anglican church entered into the settlement agreement against the wishes of the Anglican Council of Indigenous Peoples. I did not know this. Entering into the agreement meant that Indigenous peoples had to give up their right to pursue legal action for loss of language and culture. And in fact, the agreement stipulated that if Indigenous peoples did attempt to take legal action, we as a church had to stand against them. The Anglican Council of Indigenous Peoples asked the Anglican Church of Canada not to enter into this agreement, but we did. And what I learned is that this created a break in trust and relationship. It was a very important context for me to understand as I tried to process the responses that I had received. I believe it's very important for us as a church to both know this and name this as we seek to live and relate in new ways with one another based on truth. Despite this painful context, almost all participants in this exercise agreed that there were positive impacts on our church because of the settlement agreement. It definitely sent us on a new trajectory in our church. 5 of the positive impacts include, and there are many more, the establishment of the Primates Commission on Discovery, Reconciliation, and Justice, the establishment and work of the Vision Keepers Council, the naming of the Jubilee Commission, the emerging self-determining Indigenous Anglican Church within the Anglican Church of Canada, which predated the settlement agreement. But I think for the non-Indigenous church, we began to recognize and see that in a new way. Education regarding the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the historical and current effects of colonization. Participants were also very honest about their concerns regarding both the settlement agreement and where we are at now with reconciliation more generally. 5 of these concerns included the challenge of changing the hearts of the whole church, down to the pews, someone said. A lack of ongoing safe spaces for Indigenous people to tell their stories and be listened to over and over as long as it takes. The ongoing issue that many Indigenous clergy are unpaid and non-stipendiary. Little recognition and understanding regarding institutionalized racism as opposed to personal prejudice in the church, and the inactivity of the anti-racism working group of the Council of General Synod. And finally, the concern that much parish leadership was not seen to be getting involved in building relationships in local Indigenous communities. There was a sense of apathy or compassion fatigue, someone said, which is defined as indifference to charitable appeals on behalf of those who are suffering, experienced as a result of the frequency or number of such appeals. I do hear this on my travels through the church. People saying, we've talked about this over and over. How long do we need to keep talking about this? So I do hear this along the way. 2 questions. What would you do differently? And what advice would you give others entering into this kind of process were asked of participants. In reviewing responses to these questions, a pattern emerged in the form of a need for reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Anglicans, and between the Anglican Church of Canada and Indigenous people who are not affiliated with the church. In both cases, I narrowed the responses down to 3 tangible ways that we as the Anglican Church of Canada can live into reconciliation both within our church and more broadly. Within the Anglican Church, it's apparent that the signing of the settlement agreement marked a break in relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples within our church. While some healing has taken place, it became clear to me in the responses to this exercise that there is a need to return to the covenant of 1994, a covenant of our journey of spiritual renewal. The associated Pinawa Declaration and Mississauga Declaration, which followed thereafter, and the 2014 document, Where We Are Today. Practical ways of living into the covenant could include new, creative, sustainable funding for and partnership with Indigenous ministries and the self-determining Indigenous Anglican Church. A renewed commitment to anti-racism work at the national church level and beyond. Ongoing education of Anglicans on the history and legacy of the Indian residential schools system. Treaties, Indigenous rights, self-determination, and the current manifestations of racism and colonialism. Continued efforts at reconciliation between the Anglican Church and Indigenous peoples more broadly emerged as a separate but interrelated theme. While Indigenous Anglicanism is strong and amazing, there are many Indigenous people and communities with whom the Anglican Church has no relationship, What is our role in healing and relationship building with these communities? Some answers that I heard included intentional and sustained funding for the Anglican Healing Fund, which is available to Indigenous healing projects, and applicants do not need to have any church affiliation in order to be applicants to the Anglican Healing Fund. And I give great thanks to the longstanding work of my dear friend and mentor, Esther Wesley, and am very grateful to be working with Martha Many Grey Horses, Dr. Martha Many Grey Horses, as she continues that work. Continued advocacy in Indigenous-led movements for inherent rights. The building of a stronger national network of local reconciliation work. These are only 3 of the myriad of ways that reconciliation is both possible and necessary. As some of you know, especially in this diocese, I worked for 12 years in the Anglican Church archives, so I know what happens to reports. Multiple copies of reports. I have seen many of them come and go and be filed away to be looked at 50 years later by that one church geek who really wants to know. I have been one. I'm here to tell you that what happens, the next steps, are really up to you, to us. Please read at least the summary document in your convening circular. It has hyperlinks to both the full report as well as background documents. Feel free to share it with others. And hey, while you're there, just read the full report. Like me, you may be surprised by what you find there. There are sections unpacking reconciliation within our church and between communities outside of our church as well. Talk with others in your parish, your diocese, your committees, your provincial synods about how you might respond to the sections on doing things differently and reconciliation within and broadly. You can also learn about reconciliation and access a wide array of resources at www.anglican.ca/reconciliation toolkit and sign up for the Anglican Reconciliation Connections newsletter, letting you know what's happening in reconciliation both within our church and in the wider society. It also has examples of what others are doing that you may find inspiring, and I encourage you to email me with what's happening in your neck of the woods so that I can share it more broadly. And of course, you can get in touch with me if you would like to chat more about it. At this point, I would like to particularly thank all those who filled out the online survey, many of whom are in this room. All those Indigenous leaders who agreed to in-person interviews. I honor you. I lift my hands to you. Particular thanks also go to the community of Lytton, British Columbia, to Bishop Barbara Andrews and the Reverend Angus Muir, who brought together a survivors' circle to talk about their experience in their particular area. To the survivors who did the emotional labor of revisiting their experiences. I recognize that in many cases it was not easy and brought up feelings and memories that were and are difficult. I honor that and will continue to listen and mourn with you and celebrate with you in your resilience. Thank you. Thank you to the survivors who called us to this work. Through the example of Jesus, it was and continues to be your courage, bravery, and resilience that inspires this work and challenges us to love and live into the gospel in new and prophetic ways. This work is dedicated to you. Going back to that reading from the ever-popular hit from Ezra, we are all on different points in this journey of healing and rebuilding. Some are shouting for joy, and we need to remember that some are also weeping, and that's okay. Because as Ezra and the psalmist both remind us, God is good and God's love endures forever. And in this love, we can move forward together. Thanks be to God. Archbishop, Primate, and my boss for a few more days, I hand it over to you for resolution number A100, the All Parties Lessons Learned exercise. Thank you.
Thank you. So the resolution to which Melanie referred is A100. And if we could have that up on the screen, that would be helpful, please. And this is moved by Cynthia Haynes-Turner and seconded by Peter Wall. Do you wish to speak to the motion, Cynthia? No? So there's the text of the motion. A discussion. Yes, John Rye, microphone 1, please.
Recognizing that the history of residential schools happened across the whole of the former British Empire, with similar schools in New Zealand, Australia, India, South Africa, East Africa, are there any arrangements for these reports to be shared with others that are going through the same process?
Thanks for the question, and I think Melanie is going to address it.
Thank you, John. That's actually a fantastic question because one of the things that is happening in the midst of this lessons learned report and the final report, which will come from all of the parties, is that we're being asked by other commissions that are forming in other parts of the country what our experiences are. And there's also a lot of research that's happening, intercultural work as well as interdisciplinary work, looking at truth and reconciliation commissions and what can be learned. It will also inform other Canadian settlement agreements around the day scholars and the day schools, as well as some of the Indian hospitals litigation that's currently under review. So yes, these are being looked at by people worldwide.
Thank you, Melanie. Any other discussion? All right. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed, if any? The motion is carried. Thank you. Now, we move to the report of the Primate Commission on Discovery, Reconciliation and Justice, and we welcome Bishop Priscilla Shaw to the podium. And quite a few other people with you, who you will introduce to us all.
Yes, I will.
Thank you, Bishop.
Please come. Good evening.
Good evening.
It's a privilege and an honor to be here in this capacity. Thank you for your attention at this time. It's my privilege to share with you a bit of the final report from the Primates Commission on Discovery, Reconciliation and Justice, a commission that was convened between 2013 and this year, 2019. Our final report was presented to COGS in March, and you will find that it has been recently added to your convening circular. I would like to say we have particular heartfelt gratitude and appreciation to our primate, Archbishop Fred Hiltz, who's leaned into this ministry with his whole heart and soul. And we thank our National Indigenous Anglican Bishop, Bishop Mark MacDonald.
We thank you both for your commitment in moving this work forward. We honor the blessed memory of our co-chair, Archbishop Terry Finley, 2013 to 2018, with respect for his wisdom, humility, and courage, his wit, and his gracious and steadfast presence. With gratitude and appreciation for our members of this commission over the years, especially our co-chair and elder, the Reverend Canon Andrew Wesley from Toronto, and also from Moosonee, Moose Factory, and up north. And our faithful and committed commission members, Verna Firth from Inuvik, Dixie Bird from Montreal Lake, Reverend Canon Laverne Jacobs from Walpole Island, John Bird from Peterborough, Jennifer Henry, who's with Kairos in Toronto, the Very Reverend Jonas Alulu from Iqaluit, the Reverend Janaki Bandera, our Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada partner and Six Nations in Cambridge minister, Bishop Lydia Amamakwa, Bishop Lydia, from the Indigenous Spiritual Ministry of Mishamakwish, Kingfisher Lake, the Reverend Amos Winter, also from Kingfisher Lake, the Reverend Stan McKay from the United Church of Canada, ecumenical partner and in Winnipeg, Saul Sanderson from Prince Albert, Bud Smith in British Columbia, Bishop Sidney Black from Siksika, Alberta, Ellie Johnson in Oakville, and myself, Priscilla Shaw. Especially also gratitude and appreciation for the members of the Church House staff and Indigenous Ministries staff, the Reverend Canon Ginny Doctor, Teresa Mandrix, who's here somewhere, Teresa, and Melanie Delva. Thank you. A quick note, established in 2013, the Primates Commission on Discovery, Reconciliation, and Justice contributed to the Anglican Church of Canada's ongoing response to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Comprised of First Nations, Inuit, Métis, and non-Indigenous Anglicans and ecumenical partners, the Commission was tasked with reviewing church structures and policies to identify and seek ways to dismantle the doctrine of discovery, create a plan for reconciliation, and address injustices in and towards Indigenous communities. The Commission also supported the Anglican Church of Canada's actions towards implementation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action. The Commission's mandate comes to an end at this General Synod. However, it is clear that the work of truth-telling, justice-seeking, and reconciliation is ongoing and must continue to involve the whole Church. National coordination and support is required for important diocesan and regional reconciliation efforts to enable cross-church connections and help contribute Anglican presence in ecumenical initiatives. As Melanie said in the report we just heard, we have work to do in the building of a stronger national network of local reconciliation work. So I draw your attention to resolution number A180 with the Ambassadors for Reconciliation. I hand that over to Archbishop Fred. And we have a seconder, the Reverend Lon Tostego, Chair of Reconciliation and Beyond team in the Diocese of BC. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bishop Priscilla. Let's show our appreciation for the report first. Thank you. So resolution 180 is before us. Here it comes on the screen. And it is moved and seconded, directing the Council of General Synod to establish a committee to strategize and guide the ongoing work of truth, justice, and reconciliation, including building and supporting a network of ambassadors for reconciliation from dioceses and regions. Motion is before the House. Discussion. Okay, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, if any? Carried. Thank you very much.
Thank you. With heartfelt gratitude also, I would like to invite Lisa Berry of Anglican Video up and the Reverend Canon Ginny Doctor to talk with you briefly about the Doctrine of Discovery video, which we are about to watch.
Sego, Scanago, Ungwe Hongwe Ni. It's a pleasure to be here tonight to introduce this monumental work. Back in 2013, our primate established a commission, and one of the mandates was to develop resources to educate the Church of Canada about the doctrine of discovery and its impacts on all Canadians, not just Indigenous, but settlers as well. So one of the things they thought would be good is a video. And I said, okay, we can make that work. So I talked with Lisa and said, how much to make a 20 to 15 minute video about the doctrine of discovery? So she said, about $15,000. I said, okay, and I wrote a grant and we got some money to do it. Well, that was just one part. Because what happened after that is Lisa. Lisa, in her energy and her creative genius, did much research and decided that the story, in order to be told right, had to be a longer video, which meant more money. But we did it through the help of many contributors. We pulled it together. And Lisa, who I knew as a colleague at first, through this process, we became friends. And it's that relationship that is very meaningful to me, because it was all about reconciliation as well. And so Lisa, I not only call her my colleague, but I call her my friend now. And as a token of my friendship for her, I want to present her with these beads. These are cedar beads for protection. And I'd like her to say a few words, because she really worked hard to make this happen. And it was a great pleasure to be able to work with her.
Thank you, Ginny. Never tell Ginny Doctor that you'll do anything for her, because then she'll make you do this and make me cry before I speak to you. It was a very, very great privilege and an honor to work on this project, to be guided by Ginny, by Rusilla, by the primate, to meet and interview some of the most brilliant and gifted academics, historians, lawyers, politicians in this country, most of them Indigenous, who inspired me and drove the project to grow and to truly encompass what I believe is an eye-opening revelation. I hope it was for me, this journey. I hope it will be for you, and I ask you to share it if you are inspired by it.
Thank you. And I just want to add a story. When we were getting ready for the premiere screening in Toronto, I sent a text to Lisa and told her that she had to introduce the video. And she wrote back and she said, "I'm too shy." And I wrote back to her, I said, "I'm much more shy than you are." And so we were having this debate via text. And along came Fred, and Priscilla was in on this too. And along came my primate and wanted to know what was going on. So I told him our dilemma. I didn't want to do it, and Lisa didn't want to do it, because we were too shy. Guess what he said? BS. I had to tell on him. So this video will challenge you. I know some of you have probably seen it, but even if you've seen it before, it'll still present challenges because I find every time I watch it, I get more out of it. So without further ado, let's roll.
We're going to invite Aaron forward, actually.
Oh, I'm sorry. Before we actually do that, Aaron Salt is going to sing us an honor song.
Hello, yes, my name is Aaron Salt. I'm a Mohawk from the Six Nations Reserve. I was asked to sing a Cree honor song here today. I couldn't learn one fast enough, but I learned all my songs from the Walking Buffalo from the Enoch Cree Nation. And I'm going to sing you a song here today that they told me would be similar. So I'm going to sing this, and this is the best that I can do.
Please stand.
Yaha, yaha, day, day, yo, way, yaho, wait, oh, hey, hey, yo. Yaha, yaha, day, day, yo, way, yaho, wait, oh, hey, hey, do. Dapama, name me do, da, wa, oh, da, hey, yay, yay. Ne, jay, wa, kan, ne, da, name me do, da, wa, hey, hey, do. Yaha, yaha, day, day, yo, way, yaho, wait, oh, hey, hey,
empires of England, Spain, France, and Portugal divided up the world. And they were very active in terms of exploring the world and taking our lands illegally that were already occupied by indigenous nations worldwide. So they went to the Pope of the Catholic Church to validate the illegal taking of the lands. And what did the Pope do in the 14th century? He issued a papal bull. The papal bull provided instructions that indigenous peoples are not human or Christian. Because indigenous people are not human, they don't have sovereignty in government.
I remember reading it and thinking, that doesn't make sense. How can you simply take over somebody's territory by saying you no longer exist or you never existed because we didn't know about you?
It wasn't until I was older and starting to educate myself on our history and what had happened and why our communities are in these states was when I heard the doctrine of discovery for the first time. So I just remember reading it and thinking, like, this can't be real. This isn't something that makes sense. This is something that's like inhumane and just not something that was fair to the people that were the protectors of this land.
Another word for this is terra nullius, empty land. And the land is made empty not by clearing the people out, but it's made empty through law.
Chief Justice John Marshall basically said, in simple terms, we are sovereign because of the doctrine of discovery. We have the right to govern this land because we discovered it. And he wasn't talking about we in the American sense, he was talking about we in the white man sense. And that therefore, those nations that were here, those Indian nations that were here, are now semi-sovereign nations. So they're no longer sovereign. They are dependent upon our sovereignty, our willingness to let them retain some elements of sovereignty.
It's relevant because not only is it basically the root of the whole structure of property law in Canada and the United States and Australia, for instance, but it is thoroughly enmeshed in the structures of our law so deeply that it's often difficult to even spot it.
This fiction, this hidden foundation still lives with us because we don't assume, by and large, that Indigenous peoples today are primitive or have lower social skills on this kind of hierarchy of civilizations. But nevertheless, the law continues to assume that sovereignty of the crown is paramount, that crown title is underlying all of our land, when in fact that comes from nowhere. It comes from just an assertion.
The underlying question is how, in the Canadian context, for instance, where does the Crown get its right to hold underlying title for all lands, which is the way that our law is structured? Where does the Crown get its jurisdiction over all matters? And there's this sense that this came out of the ether. It was always thus. Starting at the time of the first colonial incursions into the Americas, there had to be justification. Why did the colonial powers have the right to take over these lands and assert their sovereignty or their jurisdiction? What did they do about the fact that there were people here already who were living in, using these lands, exercising their own laws, having their own political structures? There had to be some sort of justification to allow that colonial authority to be asserted.
Sadness surrounds me, traveling through Aboriginal homeland, see things that others can't. Longhouses, smoke bellowing from the center, surrounded by wooden palisades, brown woman tending the three sisters, the corn, the beans, the squash, men wandering through the bush, hunting for deer and other sustenance. Children running through the woods, playing games, laughing. Mohawk River flows, Creator's artery, bringing fish for harvest, a waterway for travel. Can smell the sweetgrass, the strawberries, the first fruits of summer.
We occupied the whole Turtle Island, US and Canada, now North America. And our nations and our people were granted inherent rights by the Creator.
It wasn't an empty land, and there were lots of government sort of structures. The Mi'kmaq had different provinces. They used to come together on, regular meetings. The 5 nations and then the 6 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy. These were people who were mostly farmers.
In Ontario, it's estimated that there was about 90 to 110,000 people living here when the Europeans came in. When the Jesuits, for instance, came in 1615, along with Samuel de Champlain, encountered the Wendat people, the Huron. There they lived as 40,000 people between what's now Barrie, Orillia, and Collingwood. And they were in villages of 2,000 people, and there were 200 miles of roads that were connecting these villages.
And there were trade routes everywhere. They found parrot feathers in the Arctic. The trade routes were the incredible way of getting around and ensuring that people were able to survive. So if you've got all of this territory in corn from the early Haudenosaunee peoples, and you've got northern hunters with moose meat and deer meat, and there's going to be trade. This area was settled because of the wealth of the waters as well, not just the land.
We were highly organized and structured in our governing systems, and we had the kinship clan systems of the various nations on Turtle Island, and really major functions, duties, and responsibilities of each of the clans in the kinship clan system that formed the basis of how we structured our governing systems.
The essence of the clan system is that you respect the gifts that different people bring. And so some people are really good hunters, and some people are really good cooks, and some people are really good with money, and some people are good intellectuals. And the essence of the clan system is you respect what each of them bring, and collectively we figure it out.
What I often refer to is who made the laws, who made the rules. The female side, the grandma, the moms made the rules in the family, the home, and the community. And as men, we had to enforce them.
The whole concept of buying and selling land was a foreign concept to us. We didn't believe in it. We didn't believe that the land could be bought and could be sold, and that we were letting people use the land, and it was not a permanent transfer.
It is about thriving cultures with political structures, with their own legal norms, with their own systems of exercising jurisdiction, with their own property laws. And many of those societies continue to today. So a really wonderful example of that in a Canadian context right now is the archaeological discoveries that have been confirmed in the within the last 2 years on the BC coast. So in the area of the Heiltsuk First Nation. One is the excavation of a 15,000-year-old village site that the Heiltsuk community today knew about. So within their living memory, they knew that this was a place that their community had used 15,000 years ago and had continued to use for the past 15,000 years.
But then I see blood. My ancestors covered in red lifelessness. Settlers' blood too. Who was right? Who was wrong? Both wanted good life, good land. Now I see farmlands. Wonder if they grow the Three Sisters. see hard pavement that was once soft trail, good to walk with deerskin moccasins. Old stone buildings and homes carved out of once pristine land now replace longhouses and a good, creator-given life that was before.
Over the years, 50 years now that I've been walking that way, so I've met many First Peoples but I've been able to develop relationships with them as people. I began to learn the facts, the truth, the history. The fact that we signed treaties that the Indian people, as we talked about Indians, had been here for thousands of years, and we were the newcomers among them, and we were the people who came and lived within their territory, their homeland, and they accepted us as neighbors. They were willing to take us in.
There's an innate respect in our people for everyone and everything, because everyone is a creation of the Creator, is created by God. Therefore, that's an automatic respect. And so we just went along with them and helped them get along and helped them survive.
There's a complicated set of factors that broke this relationship that was quite strong at one point. Settlers needed Indigenous peoples for knowing about the land, how to survive, food. Often it was just men coming along, and so there was partnerships formed, and the children were mixed between European and Indigenous parents, and that went on for 250 years in North America and was quite strong and developed distinctive cultures in many of those places. I think what started to erode that was the development of a mercantile system that could alienate or separate people from one another through trade that then had war attached to it.
Canada has not got the reputation the United States has, where there was a lot of killing and shooting and burying of bodies. In Canada it was a little more subtle. These people that were here were in the way. And so how do we remove these people in a way that isn't bloodletting, but confines them someplace else? And so that was the remove people from their lands, put them in a space where we can contain them, control their access to resources. With MacDonald, John A. MacDonald, our first Prime Minister, it was let's just starve them to death. If they can't eat and they can't survive, they can't make babies, they can't continue.
Of course, if you want to disorient any population, the first thing you must do is somehow break their contact with the land. Because the land on which they live is the source of their identity, their medicines, their food, their ability to self-sustain.
And then that didn't work, so let's just take their children away, and we'll teach their children how to do things our way.
Let's help them by taking their kids from them and raising them in Western ways, and sort of take them in. You strip them of their clothes, you shave their hair, you douse them with lye, you put them in identical clothing, and when they try to speak their languages, you put pins through their tongues, you punish them corporally, you tell them that their parents aren't and their communities aren't worthy of emulation.
Can you imagine a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old taken from their parents, institutionalized, and then everything good about being a First Nations person is no good? Their beautiful long hair was cut. Their beautiful languages weren't allowed. Their access to their families and their ceremonies were disallowed. And everything they've known, the pride in who they were as a First Nation, it's no good. Your family's no good, your community's good, your nation's, First Nation's no good. In fact, you're no good. Then on top of that, you put on that physical abuse, then sexual abuse and mental abuse. you are not healthy coming out of that institution.
The doctrine of discovery is something that we could say clearly was behind the residential schools because it was about Christian and European superiority and the notion of remaking Indigenous people in that image. For their benefit was the perspective, for their benefit either in this world or the next. And we know the impacts of the residential schools didn't stop with the closing of the residential schools, that those impacts spilled over into generations and are causing intergenerational trauma even to this day.
My grandfather had to allow his kids to be taken from his home, or he'll get his treaty card taken away. I can't remember what it is, but it was something that was that important. And for a man to see his kids getting taken, just makes me like scared. Like, how would I react if that was me with my kids or anybody else's kids? How could you live the next day? And then that's where that addiction comes in, because you're weak and you're sad and there's nothing to you don't have your spirit. Your spirit is lost.
I carry my parents' hurt. And I'm the first generation that didn't attend residential school. And I think what is hard is that I still hear their stories, and to know their pain and suffering is the saddest thing.
I think virtually all the social ills in Indigenous communities today are the result of the disorientation that occurred for Indigenous populations because of that residential school era. And it's primarily an emotional and spiritual dislocation. Yes, it was physical and economic and social and other kinds of dynamics like that, but for Indigenous people ourselves, it's that emotional, spiritual disorientation that becomes a major complication in life.
And for me, I've always said it's about the loss of spirituality, the loss of knowing who they are as Indigenous people, Indigenous youth. And that goes, that's one of the legacies of the residential schools. So a lot of our young people don't know who they are.
And a lot of our men don't have, traditional culture. They don't understand where they came from. They don't really speak about it anymore. Yeah, so it's really sad. Like with the residential schools, there's a lot of impacts. Right to abuses, like physical, mental, even like lateral violence and all of that stuff. It's really sad.
Martin Brokenleg talks about us, the need to belong to something. And if your family has been destroyed, your family life has been destroyed through drugs and alcohol, then you don't have a family. You don't have a family to belong with. So therefore, they may go where they can find a family, such as gangs or other negative influences like that.
Read Rupert Ross's Indigenous Healing. Essentially what he says is that the first generation of Indigenous children going into schools were so overwhelmed, they simply shut themselves off emotionally. And of course, as a therapist, I've seen that happen for lots of people, but certainly with Indigenous populations, and it's the right thing to do. If you're a vulnerable kid or a vulnerable adult and life is simply overwhelming, it's probably best just to shut down, hunker down and hold on, because that's what that generation did. But there's a cost, and the cost is you never become skilled in managing your own emotional world. And then you can't teach those skills to your children and to your grandchildren. And when people can't manage themselves emotionally, they drown those emotions with alcohol, numb them with drugs or busyness or sex, or they turn those unmanaged emotions inward and they become depression and suicide, or they turn them outward and they become vandalism and violence. All those issues that we see, those pathologies that we see in Indigenous populations, I think Ross is right. It's one of the legacies. It's the psycho-emotional and spiritual displacement that is the equivalent of the land displacement that the doctrine of discovery is trying to generate in the first place.
Aboriginal communities are profoundly affected by the issues of institutional racism in the penal system. 5% of the Canadian population is Indigenous, 25% of the men and 35% of the women in penal institutions are Indigenous. In parts of the country, it's higher. In Manitoba, 65% of the men in Stony Mountain are Indigenous, and I believe it's now about 90% of the women in Headingley, which is the women's prison in Manitoba. Those are shockingly disproportionate levels of incarceration.
Today we have new kinds of stressors. We have the missing and murdered Indigenous women. In the last 70 years we've had child welfare, and those are kind of adding to that already toxic stew that's been generated over the course of time. So intergenerational effect, or legacy effect, is something that I also call it, is about people not having the opportunity to sit down and have a discussion about what's going on in their community, within themselves, within their families, and actually being able to process that to the extent that they can say, I can take a big breath here. I know there's not something terribly wrong with me. I'm actually suffering from something that has been handed down through generations because we have not had the opportunity to resolve.
The doctrine of discovery is the principle that all the underlying title to property, all the underlying authority and jurisdiction rests with the colonial crown.
It's a legal fiction. I spent much of my life as a therapist, and it's stunning when a client realizes they have lived much of their life with an illusion. Like, for example, I can't sing. People will say, well, the truth is most people can sing. It's because if you ask them, who told you you cannot sing and how old were you when they told you that, they'll be able to identify both. It's when in fact they were a vulnerable child that someone said to them, you cannot sing, and they believed it. And so then they build their life experience on that illusion. Well, that's what Western culture has done with the doctrine of discovery. It has built a reality. It's set up legal precedent. It believes it is true, but it is a legal fiction.
The doctrine of discovery, as you know, has been validated by the Supreme Court in the U.S. for implementation. And because the English common law system applying in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and parts of India, that Supreme Court decision applies here, and it continues today.
The Crown has not recognized Indigenous sovereignty. We still, by and large, have this Indian Act. The Indian Act was passed in 1876, designed to assimilate us. It's still the law today, and there's been very few amendments from that almost 150 years ago, 140 some odd years ago to this point. The Indian Act is archaic. It's designed to make Indians into good Victorian citizens of kind of the 1870s. Its very purpose is to erase the presence of Indians through their attrition and then teach them how to be like good citizens of that once upon a time era.
The form of laws constructed for Indians today, based on those objectives of the Papal Bull, the doctrine of discovery, and those Empire Canadian colonial policies, have resulted in systemic racism in the laws of Canada for Indians. I often laugh when they say, oh, we have Indian laws. There's Indian laws. Those aren't Indian laws. Those are laws made by Canada respecting Indians. It's not our law.
How do you take a whole population of people on a national scale and tell them that they have no right to make a decision? The idea was, we will make the decisions for you. We will make decisions about housing, we'll make decisions about economics, we will make decisions about your education, and if you have a decision to make, we'll make that decision for you too, right? You don't get to make any kind of decision without actually going through us. And the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs still has the authority to make those decisions, still has to resolve questions around bylaws. I have a will, I have a job, I have a car, 2 cars, I have a house. But if I died this week, the minister still has the power to change my will if she so desires, as of today, now.
Indigenous people are falling between the cracks of federalism. If we think we're trying to solve something, we ask the federal government to do it, and they try to apply their authorities, or we ask the provincial governments to do it, and they try to apply their authorities. But that's still other people making decisions for us as Indigenous peoples. What we need is some place where our authorities are recognized, and yes, we'll make mistakes, but we'll also then correct our mistakes like all other governments do, and if we don't correct them, right, there's going to be consequences for that. That needs to be a part of the way we think about our relationships.
We've won hundreds of Supreme Court decisions, and the latest one being the Williams decision, the Chilcotin decision. The Supreme Court said Aboriginal rights and title are recognized for, like, we've always said that. Now we have the highest court of Canada, Supreme Court of Canada, saying the same thing. We have the judicial branch of government, the legislative branch of government, and the executive branch of government. So you have the judicial branch of government clearly saying something that we've been saying for years, that Aboriginal rights and title are recognized. We've always had it. We have pre-existing rights as Indigenous peoples. You have the judicial branch saying that. If the legislative branch keeps up with that now, they have to get in line with what the judicial branch is saying. So I mean, all the laws have to keep up. The executive branch, the policies have to keep up. So if the legislative and the executive branch don't keep up with what the judicial branch is saying, you have a disconnect. So we have to really work hard and in partnership, in a collaborative way with this government to fix all their illegal and racist laws and policies. And that's a lot of work, but it can get done. That will really be reconciliation in action when that happens.
What do we want our country to be built on? Do we want it to be built on this notion of others, people being inferior? Or can we build our country on the idea that we can agree and we can find ways to persuade one another? And I think that persuasion is more in line with our Canadian values.
To me, being Métis is being twice blessed. I'm part of 2 family trees that are rich. My First Nation grandmothers and my grandfathers that were often from Scotland or Orkney Islands, England, and there's also the French Métis.
In Canada, prior to Canada becoming Canada and provinces becoming provinces, the Métis people arose in what we refer to as the historic Northwest and developed their own distinct language, culture, identity, known as the Métis Nation, often referred to as Riel's people. What you see along the routes of the fur trade, in particular in the Northwest, is these distinct communities emerge, but in particular in the Red River settlement area, a coalescing of an identity, a nationhood. Those peoples, and what is a people in international law and domestically is, there's a common language, there's a shared history, there's a territory, there's a collective consciousness where they assert themselves as a people. And of course the Métis were not here at first contact. They emerged as a distinct people on the plains nearly 200 years ago, and that is who the Métis people are.
Are you Métis? It's not only being of mixed ancestry, it's more than that. It's about identifying with the culture and participating as you're able, right?
What the Métis story, though, is it's really a story of denial, neglect, and not recognizing that that is a people. Interestingly, they did when they needed us back in 1869 and 70. There was no way through what is now Manitoba without dealing with Riel's people at the Red River settlement and Métis people pushing back and saying, no, you will deal with us. And that begat the Manitoba Act and the promise of 1.4 million acres of land in what used to be the postage stamp province of Manitoba. That peoplehood was recognized. You treated nation to nation, government to government to get that deal that brought Manitoba into Confederation and then allowed for treaties to be negotiated in the rest of Western Canada as well as the rest of Western Canada to be brought into Confederation. What Canada did, though, was had amnesia of, well, we recognized you as a people, we had this treaty relationship, nation to nation, government to government in 1869-70, but we got what we wanted.
As the railway was going across the country, land was becoming more precious, and Métis people were asked to leave, right? They didn't have the right title to a land, so it was like, well, it's not yours, you must leave. So there's that land piece.
Métis have had to go to court to prove that they have rights, and they're defined by colonial courts, right? They're defined in a way of not, and as a right by right perspective. Doctrine of discovery assumes Canada's got it all, and you've got to pull it down, jurisdiction by jurisdiction, right by right, what we will recognize or accept. And I think that still plays out for the Métis daily.
The concept of the doctrine of discovery has always been a part of Métis life, the impact of that, but having it named, that was an important moment for me, to have it named.
It's kind of interesting. It's like one of those sci-fi movies that it takes different forms all the time, whether it's the Indian Act or whether it's denial of Métis rights, and we don't realize it, right? And to a certain extent, Canadians are fed it in different ways, right? It's the idea that you hear, the negative comments you hear of, oh, well, we're giving First Nations, Métis everything, those sorts of comments where it's not a recognition of Canada's built upon these solemn promises and relationships that we've been doing a lot of sharing over the last 150 years. And you're seeing it from the view of, well, because you discovered, you've got it all.
There's a lot of work that has been done, but there's a lot of work left to be done. But the Métis are still here, yeah.
Inuit are not First Nations and we're not Métis. We are one of the 3 Indigenous peoples of Canada, and we are part of a global Indigenous community. We are a minority Indigenous population within Canada, and often Canadians know nothing about us.
When I come down here to the schools to talk about our way of life in the North, they say, children ask me, do you live in igloo? Yes, we do. I do live in igloo, but on the second floor. In my part of the world, well, we did not have any say as to what we should do in our lives. It was all governed by the people from the South.
After World War II in the early 1950s, that's when massive change had happened at an incredible speed. So forced relocations, coerced settlement into communities, children being taken from families for residential school, entire populations being taken for TB treatment in the South. The killing of our sled dogs once people were coerced into communities, imposition of people who were responsible for us in those communities through basically an Inuit-style Indian agent. All of this happened in such a short period of time in many parts of the Canadian Arctic. We do not fall under Canada's Indian Act, and we have modern treaties, which are very different than historical treaties or other First Nations groups that don't have any treaties at all. We co-manage about 3.5 million square kilometers of this country, about 35% of Canada's landmass. And we have self-governments, we have created a territory through Nunavut, through our land claim agreement in Nunavut. So our reality is underpinned by a very different reality than most First Nations.
The changes are coming rapidly right now to the north, where people are taking ownership of themselves and to their land and how they should govern it. They're trying very hard to stand up.
The underpinning of what we see as normal today and the treatment of Indigenous people, the way we imagined, the way Canada or the United States imagined land, governance, respect for rights, all is underpinned by these foundational documents, especially the Doctrine of Discovery. Only about 16 to 18% of our Aboriginal title-held land becomes fee simple land that's owned by Inuit. And we don't have full access to subsurface resources or offshore resources the way that other nation states do. And that is all a product of the way in which the Doctrine of Discovery influenced the way governments thought about us and the way that the general population thought about Inuit. It isn't just looking back and apologizing for something that doesn't mean anything to anyone anymore. It is a narrative of a relationship. And you can get beyond the challenges that we faced in the past. We can get beyond the human rights abuses that we have endured based on this doctrine. If people understand what it meant, why it changed our societies the way it did, and how the repudiation and now working with Indigenous people and working with Inuit and respecting also our self-determination demands that we stop and pause and say the way that we understood the world was wrong. Anything that we can do to tell a narrative that is truthful to the past and hopeful for the future with the respect that's necessary to us as a people is essential in reconciliation and also just in being a good, loving person and a part of a good and loving society.
We are left with Gunalunkwa. the great love from the ancestors. And with that, we go on to breathe and heal, to be strong like our ancestors, to keep the good mind.
First of all, we've got to open ourselves to listen to the truth. And we've got to accept the fact that the truth of our relationship from the First Peoples' point of view is a different story altogether. And there has to be healing. We must find ways to keep talking with one another, sharing with one another, and allowing healing to happen before there can ever be reconciliation.
There's a huge gap between what is experienced by settler communities and what is experienced by Indigenous people in terms of health, in terms of threat of violence, in terms of education levels, in terms of rates of incarceration. There's this gigantic gap.
This gap has to close. That's reconciliation. Because this gap represents everything we talk about. It represents the 80+ boil water advisories. It represents the 1,200 missing murdered Indigenous women and girls. It represents the 40,000 kids in care, First Nations children in foster care. It represents a disproportionate number of our people in jails. It represents our overcrowded housing, the 5 to 7 times the youth suicide rate. All these negative things. That's what this 6th versus 63rd gap represents.
If you think that Indigenous people are a problem to be solved like poor people are a problem to be solved, some people think, or anybody else who's experiencing oppression or a problem to be solved, then there's a possibility that you're paternalistic at best. And paternalism and racism are on the same continuum, right? It starts off, and this is the story of Canada, it starts off as good intentions.
There are people that say, why should Indians be any different? Why should we treat them in accordance with these treaties or these special constitutional rights? Why don't they just get on with it? You know, my ancestors came here from England or Scotland or France or the Caribbean, and yes, the first generation was hard, but we've made it better for ourselves. Why don't they just do that? Which ignores the fact that we're being held down from doing that. It's true that we can leave our reserves and go to the cities, but all these structures of terra nullius travel with us.
They've taken a lot from us. A lot of our stories, we were an oral people. You know, they've practically almost taken our language, and you know, I'm really trying to learn Blackfoot from my grandparents, but there's a lot of work that we as Indigenous people have to do to ensure that we don't completely lose everything that makes us Indigenous, that makes us Nisitipi, that makes us whatever nation you come from.
I work with kids all the time. I got young people from this community that I watched, you know, going down because of drugs and alcohol, and said, okay, stop. I want you to do something different. I want you to come with me. I'm going to go to this conference, or I'm going to go to this event, and I want you to come and I want you to listen. I want you to listen to what Marie Sinclair has to say about history. I want you to listen to what I have to say about, you know, our communities and the impact that has been there because of things that you know nothing about, but you're going to learn. And I've watched those kids be successful because now they know something they didn't know.
One teaching that I really like is that the heart, well, something that I've come to realize, is the heart has the capacity to collapse time. 20 years can go by after you've been hurt by a parent or an auntie, and boom, it collapses all that time. You feel the same way. So that speaks to the intelligence of the heart.
Indigenous communities have a lot of work to do as well to overcome their victimization. And so that entails healing, but it also entails overcoming anger.
As Indigenous people, we have to be the educators. We have to really profess the history as it happened and not try to cover it up anymore.
The doctrine of discovery has become an almost like For some people, it's almost an everyday language now, whereas before it was not. Nobody knew what it was, basically. And but nowadays there is some interest, some desire to know what it is about, even though it may not be favorable. But I think in order to have healing in our lives and reconciliation, we have to know what Doctor of Discovery, what it is.
The shining water that moves in the streams and the rivers is not just water, but the blood of our ancestors. If we sell you land, you must remember that it is sacred. And you must teach your children that it is sacred, and that each ghostly reflection in the clear water of the lake tells of events and memories in the life of my people. The water's murmur is the voice of my mother's mother.
I think a simple declaration of repudiation would be sufficient, but there are many who would question whether or not that would be far enough or go far enough. And within government, I think they wouldn't quite appreciate what the significance of that is, and because they don't know what the implications are, they resist the temptation to do it, or they resist the effort to do it. There are many within government who tread carefully when it comes to changing precedent. And so for that reason alone, just the fear of what it's going to do or what it's going to cause to them and how it's going to challenge Crown sovereignty or undermine Crown sovereignty for that matter I think it's a real question. It's a real open question.
We've come to expect that the land that we live on is ours, and that we should expect a kind of certainty in that. And I think that talking about things like repudiating the doctrine of discovery, it kind of unsettles that certainty that we've come to realize. But what I think is crucial for us is to understand that there really is another truth. And that truth is that we live on Indigenous lands, that we work on Indigenous lands. And that what we have to be about in the future is a recognition of that truth and then finding a way to move forward together in that truth.
Once you pull out the linchpin and open that door, then there are going to be all these implications that are going to follow.
In the calls to action, what we suggested, recognizing that that was going to be an area of resistance, what we suggested was, let's develop together a doctrine of reconciliation through a proclamation on reconciliation and a covenant on reconciliation, because regardless of what one thinks about repudiation and the implications of it, we can go further and redefine our new relationship through those documents as well.
When I think about the doctrine of discovery, the image that comes to mind, and it's not an image that I am at all happy about, but here it is: spiritual arrogance of the worst kind.
All Christian churches who relied upon the doctrine of discovery, a principle, I think, have to make it very clear that they're no longer relying upon that, or that they recognize the invalidity of that.
Christianity got entangled with this process of colonization. It was kind of fuel to the fire. And that's a devastating thing to come to grips with.
I think that our churches are one of the biggest institutional racism organizations in Canada. I mean, and if you look at the structure, where are the Indigenous people in that structure?
Well, I think if racism is grounded on an understanding that somehow we're going to be saved from ourselves as a people, then I think racism is rife.
I am very proud to be a Catholic Christian and also a Mohawk woman. We as church people need to be strong enough and not to say, oh no, it didn't happen, or, well, I'm sorry. Just listen, and you don't have to say anything.
I first heard my first truth-telling about experiences in residential schools in 2010, and that was a game changer. That the whole ground shifted under me, because you can intellectualize this stuff to a certain degree, but then you hear stories from survivors, and it just, your head and your heart and your spirit connect differently, understand differently, learn differently. And it was sort of in that context that the doctrine of discovery, you can see the schools as a mechanism of this underlying concept. And so to see that written, to see that as an ideological concept that has shaped so much of not just church practice, but the history of European colonization in North America and in other places around the world, it's shocking.
It is very difficult to point and say, well, here it is. That's why the doctrine of discovery, I think, is a helpful way of describing it. It describes a systemic evil, a way in which a particularly dangerous and noxious idea becomes a part of the way people look at the world. It becomes a part of a worldview.
So as much as the churches are repudiating the doctrine of discovery, we have a larger challenge, which is a political challenge, which is to have it removed from our constitutions. And then the second part of that is, I think the theologies are still really strong within our thinking. And we haven't taken the time as church in our process of reconciliation to do that deep self-critique that is going to be necessary to change our worldview.
One of the great weaknesses of the TRC, in my mind, in Canada, is that as denominations, we're still separated. And every denomination has apologized for its mission history, I think. There have been many apologies, but we've never agreed that we would act collaboratively as people of faith.
How do we reflect on our baptismal vow to respect the dignity of every human being and to strive for justice and peace among all people? Here is an opportunity for us to talk about the history of our own church and our struggle to be faithful as a church to that kind of commitment associated with our baptism.
A Christian person as an individual has a twofold responsibility. Number one, they have to realize that they have been deeply influenced by these ideas, and they have to apply spiritual discipline and insight into resisting and countering these ideas in their own minds and hearts. And this is true for Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people both. This insight, I think, helps people to begin to move into advocacy and to start promoting ideas and policies in their communities and their organizations that will counter the impact of these ideas.
You might as well expect all the rivers to run backwards, as that any man who was born free should be contented to be penned up and denied liberty to go where he pleases. If you tie a horse to a stake, do you expect him to grow fat? If you pen an Indian up on a small spot of earth and compel him to stay there, he will not be contented, nor will he grow and prosper. I have asked some of the great white chiefs where they got their authority to say to the Indian that he shall stay in one place, where the white man sees that he can go wherever he pleases, and they cannot tell me. Let me be a free man, free to travel, free to stop, free to work, free to trade where I choose, free to choose my own teachers, free to follow the religion of my fathers, free to talk, think, and act for myself. And I will obey every law and submit to the penalty.
Reconciliation, I mean, just the dictionary meaning of it means, it could mean a couple things. One, to be friendly and harmonious again. So that's a good thing. But then it could also be taken as maybe you people should just reconcile yourself to the fact that this is the way it is. And sometimes I'm concerned that the latter is the case.
Reconciliation is not about being a spectator. It's not about sitting back and waiting for government and churches and corporations and business to change the way they do things. It's about changing the way you do things, too.
One of my favorite things to say is that believing in the sacred is far more rational and sustainable than the destruction of the economic paradigm. We know the economic paradigm isn't working. Why do we keep thinking that it's so powerful and it's so rational? And even Western laboratory science, it's not sustainable. We need to go back to having reverence for the land and reverence for the water and reverence for that Chaudière Falls where Creator placed the first sacred pipe, the ultimate symbol of reconciliation.
What if we're a gift? Well, we are a gift, and that our voice is important if Canada's going to understand who it is.
Everybody has to accept what they did and what had happened. And if we can get on that level, I think this world would be much more better environment to live in.
I do a lot of public education. I speak to a lot of non-Native people. I'm working with the BAM Center. We have an Allies program, and people come from all across the country. And one of the things I say to people is 97% of the population of Canada has experienced some form of trauma, and the other 3% are lying. We are all in this together.
We all share the same way of coming into the world. We all have children. We come together to raise children. We all can get together to eat together. We can pray together. We can dance together and sing together. We have to do it together, human being to human being, face to face. And can I just say, don't be afraid? Perfect love casts out fear.
Our people are so resilient, and they're still here. And there's this quote, and it's, I don't remember who said it, but it's, they tried to bury us, but they didn't realize that we are seeds.
As Native people, we have been sort of buried in Mother Earth, but our Mother continues to care for us. And through the gifts of, all of our elements, that the seed is beginning to produce a plant that is growing, and this plant is rising above the earth.
The relationship in Canada shouldn't be so adversarial. It shouldn't be so adversarial. We're supposed to get along and mutually benefit from the wealth of this country.
Nobody's going anywhere here. We're not telling you to leave. We're saying if we are going to coexist in this land, in this territory, in this place, then we now have to talk about our terms of coexistence. What kind of relationship are we going to have? How are we going to get along here? And it's like taking a relationship of slavery and trying to turn it into a marriage.
What the commissioners of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission gave us is a roadmap to move forward. So there's 94 answers to the question, what can I do now? 94 answers to that.
At every service right over here in the cathedral, the dean stands up and at the beginning of the service says,
we as a cathedral gather on the traditional ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people. Some people think it's repetitious and we've done it and it's unnecessary, but it's that drip of water on the stone that's saying the doctrine of discovery isn't right.
Thank you so much. That's a very good resource for you to take back to your parish. It's available online, and we invite you to visit the Indigenous Ministries Anglican Council of Indigenous Peoples booth and talk to the folks there about all of this stuff. It's my privilege now to call upon Vivian Seeger to sing us a victory song, and I invite you to stand.
Hi, I'm the first Indigenous woman to be ordained in this diocese, and I'm Dene Cree. So when I got ready to do the whole process of getting ordained, I got 3 black jackets. I'm going to take it off now because I'm also a sun dancer, priest, and I found out that it was okay to be a sun dancer priest about 10 years ago because I met Jay McDaniel, who's a Buddhist priest. So the sun dance is going to happen beginning Sunday night, and so I stand here for in honor of that ceremony that has been here for thousands of years. And also I want to acknowledge my elder who passed away last year, who would have normally drummed for me, I can't drum and sing at the same time. So a great loss for who needed good medical care and couldn't get it. I also would like to acknowledge the man who showed me the St. Mary's Residential School in Mission, and he was someone who attended there. And after he showed me where he slept and where he went to school, the next thing he did was tell me that he now sleeps under the bridge in Mission. And he's been attending this walk for as many years as this reconciliation walk has been going on. He has been attending this walk. So we need to open our eyes. Please open your eyes. They are near you. We are your neighbors. We're right beside you. The woman who gave us this song, her name is Martina Pierre, and she's from the Lillooet Nation. And she was in a sweat lodge ceremony praying for the well-being of her daughter who was in Vancouver. And so this is her praying that her daughter finds a good way to live and be strong and healthy. Yahiyaho, Yahiyaho, Yahiyo, Yahiyaho, Yahiyo, Yahiyaho, Yahiyaho, Yahiyo, Yahiyaho, Yahiyo, Yahiyaho, Yahiyaho, Yahiyo, Yahiyaho, Yahiyo. Everyone, Yahiyaho, Yahiyaho, Yahiyo, Yahiyaho, Yahiyo. Whew. All my relations.
We have assembled a group of elders, and we're going to ask them to come up now. You know who you are. And if you would come forward at this time, Bishop Sidney, Iola, Donna, let's see, Norm Wesley, Murray Still, Grace Delaney, and I think I've called everybody out. And at this time, we're going to invite our primate to come, and he has something to address to us all. And please, Archbishop Fred, please come forward.
Thank you for this opportunity to sit with you and to share with you an apology for spiritual harm. And I do this in the presence of the General Synod, because apology commits us all to action. For a number of years since the Indigenous Covenant of 1994, there has been a call for apology for spiritual abuse endured by Indigenous peoples through the era of colonial expansion, and particularly through the era of the Indian residential schools. In his apology to survivors of the residential schools delivered on August the 6th, 1993, Archbishop Michael Pearse expressed his remorse on behalf of the Anglican Church of Canada, saying, and I quote, "We tried to remake you in our image." Tonight, I offer this apology of our cultural and spiritual arrogance toward all Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, and the harm we inflicted on you. And I do this at the desire of many people in our church. I do it at the call of the Anglican Council of Indigenous People, and I do it at the request of and with the authority of the Council of the General Synod. I confess our sin in failing to acknowledge that as First Peoples living here for thousands of years, you had a spiritual relationship with the Creator and with the land. We did not care enough to learn how your spirituality has always infused your governance, your social structures, and your family life. We did not care enough. I confess our sin in demonizing Indigenous spiritualities and in belittling the traditional teachings of your grandmothers and grandfathers, preserved and passed on through the elders. I confess the sin of our arrogance in dismissing Indigenous spiritualities and disciplines as incompatible with the gospel of Jesus, and insisting that there was no place for them in Christian worship. I confess our sin in acts such as smothering the smudges, forbidding the pipes, stopping the drums, hiding the masks, destroying totem poles, silencing the songs, stilling the dances, and banning the potlatches. And with deep remorse on behalf of our church, I acknowledge the intergenerational trauma caused by our actions. I confess our sin in declaring the teachings of the medicine wheel to be pagan and primitive. I confess our sin in robbing your children. In robbing your children and youth of the opportunity to know their spiritual ancestry, their indigenous spiritual ancestry, and the great wealth of its wisdom and guidance in living a good way with the Creator, the land, and all their relations. For such shameful behaviors, I am very sorry. We were so full of our own self-importance. To quote the Book of Common Prayer, we followed too much the devices and desires of our own hearts. We were ignorant. And we were insensitive. And we offended you. And I believe we offended God. As we look to you today, we've come to acknowledge our need to repent. And as we look to God, again to quote the Book of Common Prayer, we say to the Creator, we have offended against thy holy laws. We have left undone those things which we ought to have done. And we have done those things we ought not to have done. I've learned that an important part of repentance is sincere lament. And that an important part of lament is our solemn intention to lead the new life, following the commandments of God, walking from henceforth in God's holy ways. So with humility, I ask our church to turn to the Creator, seeking guidance and steadfastness of will in our efforts to help heal the spiritual wounds we inflicted. Let us as a church commit ourselves to learning how traditional Indigenous spiritual practices contribute to healing and to honor them. I remind our whole church of our solemn responsibility to honor the calls to action from Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, notably call number 60. This is how it reads. We call upon leaders of the church parties to the settlement agreement and all other faiths in collaboration with Indigenous spiritual leaders, survivors, schools of theology, seminaries, and other religious training centers to develop and teach curriculum for all student clergy and all clergy and staff who work in Aboriginal communities on the need to respect Indigenous spirituality in its own right. The history and legacy of residential schools and the roles of the church's party in that system, the history and legacy of religious conflict in Aboriginal families and communities,
and the responsibility that churches have to mitigate such conflicts and prevent spiritual violence. I am praying that the General Synod will be united in directing the Council of the General Synod to establish a committee to strategize and guide the ongoing work of truth, justice, and reconciliation, including the building and supporting of a network of ambassadors for reconciliation from dioceses and regions. Working in consultation with our animator for reconciliation, a significant part of their mandate will be to forge paths for enabling healing for all deeply hurt by spiritual arrogance. Helping the whole church to learn from the spiritual wisdom of the elders and to listen with a heart to the spiritual hopes of Indigenous young people, and restoring spiritual teachings and ceremonies that were lost, and celebrating them as a vital part of a gospel-based way of life. I remind our church of our solemn responsibility to honor our General Synod 2010's public endorsement of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, drawing particular attention to Articles 12 and 25. Article 12 declares, Indigenous peoples have the right to manifest, practice, develop, and teach their spiritual and religious traditions, customs, and ceremonies, the right to maintain, protect, and have access in privacy to their religious and cultural sites, the right to the use and control of their ceremonial objects, and the right to repatriation of their human remains. Article 25 declares, Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinctive spiritual relationship with their traditionally owned or otherwise occupied and used lands, territories, waters, and coastal seas, and other resources, and to uphold their responsibilities to future generations in this regard. I call the whole church to continually pray for the vision keepers commissioned by Bishop Mark MacDonald and I at General Synod in 2016, holding our church publicly accountable in respecting the right of Indigenous peoples to be self-determining. I call our bishops, clergy, and lay leaders to draw elders into conversations regarding the practices of the past. At one time, we banned expressions of Indigenous spirituality in Christian worship. Having seen the errors of our ways, we are now encouraging such expressions. Many of the elders have followed those bans out of loyalty to a church they love. Many of these have at the same time kept alive the values and ideals and teachings of their own elders. And today they are an essential guide, both to the underlying teachings embodied in the practices of the past, as well as the teachings of Christian faith. Today we're asking the elders, with utmost of respect, to help guide us, to honor the wisdom and practice of the past, and to live into a truly Indigenous expression of our faith in the future. I have heard a number of elders speak of how the children and youth of this generation, and as you have taught me, the 7 to come, that they are in great need of the opportunity to be grounded in a spirituality true to their Indigenous identity. Let us stand with the elders in encouraging the youth to lay claim to their Indigenous spirituality as their right, and in their pursuit of health and happiness. I call the Church in consultation with the Anglican Council of Indigenous Peoples to grow that much valued resource, A New Agape 2001, a new partnership between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in the Anglican Church of Canada. I ask the whole Church to be extraordinarily generous in building up the Anglican Healing Fund and its support for initiatives that advance the healing of language and culture abuse, oppression, and the intergenerational trauma, the learning of traditional knowledge and spiritualities, celebrating Indigenous identity, and embracing the reality that Indigenous peoples should be able to enjoy everything God created you to be. I call the whole Church to fully endorse the Anglican Council of Indigenous Peoples' intention to move forward with your plan for ministry, shaped by the teaching of the elders, by gospel-based discipleship, and commitments to a prophetic pastoral care rooted in wholeness and healing in Indigenous community, freedom, and joy. And finally, I call us to renew our commitment to our baptismal covenant, especially our vow to respect the dignity of every human being, to strive for justice and peace among all people, and in living this vow in a good way, to embrace the 7 grandmother and grandfather teachings: love and respect, truth, honesty, wisdom, courage, and humility. I offer you this apology in the name of Jesus Christ, the great pain bearer and the great peacemaker. I have hope that through him and in him we will be able to walk together in newness of life. Thank you for listening to me.
read just before I received that document. I believe it was some 9 years ago, on a hot summer day in Winnipeg, and at your enthronement as the 13th primate of the Anglican Church of Canada. ASIP asked the co-chairs to present to you a pair of moccasins, certainly to wear, but at a more symbolic level, invited you to join us on a journey of healing, reconciliation, and self-determination. I'll always remember that day. Your Grace, on behalf of ASIP, on behalf of Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit people of this land, my most gracious thanks for your offering of an apology for the spiritual harms inflicted on the people of this land. This is a good thing to do. A good thing to do. As we continue to walk together in a spirit of goodwill, healing, and reconciliation. The elders of the circle have asked me we would like to take this document, we've received it, to take this document, an apology for spiritual harm, and for the elders to spend prayerful time reflecting on this moving document. Quite touched by it, and to offer our response sometimes prior to the adjournment of this meeting of General Synod. And I would like to ask or request for your consent to do that. Thank you.
We thank you all for standing at this very important moment. And for some of us, this has made us, it's very moving what we have heard, what we have witnessed. And some of us will be a little shaky because these are words that have been longed for and in some places hard to imagine that they would ever come. So we're asking, or we're offering the opportunity for Indigenous people to come together. The Anglican Council of Indigenous Peoples, ASIP, has a room on the 4th level, the Port McNeill room. And for those who wish to get together and talk and be together and sit with each other, we're going to do that immediately following the close of this gathering. So we invite Indigenous people to join us there, and we will have a chance to reflect some more
about what we have heard. So with that, at least for our part of this, we have finished.
Could I just ask Norm Wesley to come back up here to join us for leadership for night prayers? O God, be not far from us. Christ has shown forth his glory. As we sing, please have one person at each table light the candle.
Come and find the quiet center in the crowded life we lead. Find the room for hope to enter. Find the frame where we are free. Clear the chaos and the clutter. Clear our eyes that we can see all the things that really matter. Be at peace and simply be. Silence is a friend who claims us, cools the heat and slows the pace. God it is who speaks and names us, knows our being face to face, making space within our thinking, lifting shades to show the sun, raising courage when we're shrinking, finding scope for faith begun. In the Spirit, let us travel, open to each other's pain. Let our loves and fears unravel, celebrate the space we gain. There's a place for deepest dreaming, there's a time for heart to care. In the Spirit's lively scheming, there is Spirit of life, come unto me. Sing in my heart all the stirrings of compassion, blowing the wind, rise in the sea, move in the hand, giving life the shape of justice. Roots hold me close, wings set me free. Spirit of life, come to me, come to me.
The Lord be with you. A reading from Luke chapter 1, 26 to 33. In the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent by God to a town in Galilee called Nazareth, to a virgin engaged to a man whose name was Joseph, of the house of David. The virgin's name was Mary. And he came to her and said, "Greetings, favored one, the Lord is with you." But she was much perplexed by these words and pondered what sort of greeting this might be. The angel said to her, "Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God. And now you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you will name him Jesus. He will be great, and he will be called the Son of the Most High, and the Lord God will give him the throne of his ancestor David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and his kingdom there will be no end." Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church.
Please be seated at this point. We're going to sing a meditation called Beloved by Gordon Light. Please join in as you get to know the song. Your word upon deep waters, sound the wonder of your name, beloved. Out of chaos you bring order, by your grace we're called and named, beloved. Your breath gives life and raises us from dust. In your love we know this name is never lost. In gracious truth we trust. We know it is enough to be loved.
When we are most alone, you meet our longing to be found. We are beloved. When we are most at peace, in name we know we
to share this wealth, all are beloved, not ours alone, this gift that heals and mends, this word restoring life to earth's far ends, that all will share the dream and love to know their name, beloved. In this name let us rejoice. Every creature find your voice. Cry out, beloved. Make known both far and far. In every clod of dirt and star, all are beloved, beloved Maker, Holy One who names all things, beloved Christ, the source from whom all mercy springs, Spirit welling up within, ever give us strength to sing, beloved, beloved, beloved.
In our prayers tonight, we join with the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada, who, beginning their national convention, giving thanks for the partnership and asking for God's guidance. Send forth your strength, O God. Establish what you have wrought in us. Uphold all those who fall, and raise up those who are bound down. Open the eyes of the blind, and set the free. Sustain the orphan and widowed. Give food to those who hunger. Grant them the joy of your help again, and sustain them with your Spirit. Giver of peace, judge the peoples, and take all nations to you.
Believing in the promises of God and gathering our prayers and praises into the many languages God has given us. Let us pray quietly so all voices may be heard, praying as Jesus taught us. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as in heaven. Give us today our daily bread. Forgive us our sins, as we forgive those who sin against us. Save us from the time of trial, and deliver us from evil. For the kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours, now and forever. Amen.
Be thou my vision, O Lord of my heart, not be all else to me, save that thou art. Thou my best God, my day or my night, waking or sleeping, thy presence my life. Be
us bless the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Just waiting for verse 3 to come up, and we'll sing it.
I know you will need my touch as you go. Feel it pulsing in creation's ebb and flow. Like the woman reaching out, choosing faith in spite of doubt. Hold the hem of Jesus' robe, then let it go. I have given you my name, it is mine. I have given you my spirit as a sign. With my wonder in your soul, make my wounded children whole. Go and tell my precious people they are mine.
As you leave the hall, a reminder that tomorrow morning we're sitting in Bible study groups at 8:30. I would ask the members of the Agenda Committee to meet me right now in front of the head table rather than going up to our meeting room. Members of the Agenda Committee, meet me right there. Thank you.